I just stole Lily's title and just said, instead of with frictionless data, I said with NumFOCUS. So it's like total hack. This is Lily's title. Building sustainable open source, open science community with NumFOCUS. It's very, apparently we're doing very similar things. Everyone's doing interactive fiction these days, so I'll just start with about you. And let's start. Your people here often are trying to write code. You're trying to write code to save the world, and you decide to open your code and have a successful open source community. That's awesome. We have a very similar vision. We at NumFOCUS envision the world of an inclusive scientific and research community that actively utilizes supported open source software, and really, at the end of the day, to make impactful discoveries to the better world. So you build, you write blog posts, you give tutorials, you host meetups, you accept pull requests, you answer all of these user support things. Awesome. We're doing really great things. And I can see someone's who's answered my bugs over there laughing at me. We promote open practices in research, data, and scientific computing. We run educational programs. We run events. We have like our PyData events all over the world, and meetups and all sorts of user groups and whatnot. We do fiscal sponsorship, which is something that's like a kind of legal mystery. And after doing it for 8 years, I more or less understand it. But I have a lot of great professionals who can walk us through it. And then we do data scientific community. So why don't we work together? Huh? We can do it. Well, first off, let's just talk a little bit about like how we work. You got to accept some rules. We can't have innovation community without rules. We have 3 rules at NumFOCUS. You want to be a project at NumFOCUS, you first have to build tools for science. We do not build tools for corporations. We're not building tools for e-commerce. We're not building for just your side projects, right? We're really building tools for science. And science happens everywhere, labs, backyards, trenches. But at the end of the day, if you have the greatest editor in the world, that's awesome. Unless it is something that really impacts science, we would ask you to talk to any number of our other brethren who do open source communities. Second, you have to be kind to each other. This seems silly that you have to write this down, but yeah, it ends up being very important. If you don't write down your code of conduct, you don't write down your governance rules, you don't tell the world how you make decisions, we really don't want to work with you, because that means that you don't really know, or you're not willing to share it. And that's really not the kind of relationship we want. And finally, we want, and I stole this from Abby, who's talking later, you need to lead openly. Her talk's going to be great. It's more than a license. It's more than just developing on GitHub, like an open platform. It's really about making your decisions in the open, taking feedback, and learning from the community. And Abby will give a lot. I assume you're going to talk about leading open. Yep, all right. So you'll hear more about that today. So those are our 3 basic rules. All right, so that's great. How do you enforce that sort of thing? Well, we have a board and we have a manual, and you can go find it on GitHub, and I have a whole lot more words about how do we do that, and a rubric that our board has to fill out whenever you apply to work with us, and so on and so forth. And so we actually do take it pretty seriously. We have a pretty, I wouldn't call it intensive review, but you do have to make sure that you meet these criteria to work with us. Awesome, we're working together. There's a lot of work to do. Man, and you people like to eat, and they have jobs, but we need funding, right? Come work with NumFOCUS, and we'll help you pitch. So this is developed by Gina out in the audience. Is a great pitch that we've been giving to a lot of different corporations and different entities that are very interested in supporting our community. What is the dependency chain? So you look at libraries.io, and you can create these nice dependency chains. Actually, you use pandas, which really means you depend upon NumPy. And hey, by the way, when you're plotting, you actually have matplotlib in there. Did you even know that that was in your stack? So when we're talking to a company, did you realize that your company is risking so much of its revenue on these tools that you don't even know exist? Let's show you how they actually interact and work. And even to the point of, hey, look, here's pandas, and there's Sisyphean big infograph here. 28 million downloads, 10 developers. I mean, well, I guess it's, 10 core developers. I mean, this is a really, we're taking on a lot of effort for the world and helping them, and we need to tell them about what we do and how we do it. And so we have if you go to our website, we ran out of them at the booth. But we have corporate prospectuses that go through this argument and has worked at numerous corporate sponsors, and you can share it with your friends and show it to other folks and getting that word to them. So that's something we can help you do, because you're going to need some sort of pitch. This can't just be, oh yeah, I have this great code, right? Okay. Corporation says, yep, here's 100K. That's how we got started, really. The corporation was Microsoft. The project was Jupyter, and they say, here's 100K, our first real kind of thing to do. And yeah, here's this contract. It's written by corporate attorneys, the pillars of the earth. Oh, by the way, you're liable for the software and all the updates, and anything you change will be owned by the corporation, blah, blah, blah. And oh yeah, you talk to your lawyers, man, it's going to be a really tough negotiation, maybe even 20% of the actual funding that you're going to receive. Well, we've got this guy. So Van Lindbergh, who's got a great Wikipedia page about all the things he's done to fight for our community, and is director of PSF for many years. And we have a lot more professionals than just Van. He's just the best smiling face I could find. So we have lawyers, we have a team of lawyers, we have teams and a lot of executives at corporations who sit on our advisory board, who actually deal with these sorts of issues, and also very influential professors at universities who actually I find dealing with universities sponsored project offices a little bit tougher sometimes than the actual corporations. I actually had I did have one conversation with one corporation about how everything that an employee at the corporation thinks about while they're at our conferences, it belongs to the corporation. It's okay, fine, you can do whatever you want, but we'll work through that with the lawyers, right? So that is one aspect of NumFOCUS kind of coming to the table to bring with you all the expertise of corporations and legal services and whatnot that you don't really want to think about. You did all your work on that first slide. You want us to handle many of these other pieces. But I think it's also good to think about, you took $100,000. What does that really mean in the grand scheme of things? I think yesterday when we were talking about funding, we'd say, oh, that's kind of a drop in the bucket. And it's true. If you think about how companies track money and governance and how the IRS regulates things, the complexity starts to increase. And I actually, just to give you kind of an example, I come from much more of the entrepreneurship world these days, and you think about $100,000 is probably one investor, and IRS would just oh yeah, make an LLC, a sole proprietorship, and you just need a management plan, right? All the way down to all right, so I actually want an LLP, or I want 5 member friendlies, or 5 members to come in. Well, sure, they have a structure for that, and we call it an LLP, and you have an annual minutes, right? Oh well, I don't want to be taxed the same way. I want my liability to be different. Oh yeah, we got that, S corp. And now you have to give stock plans. You have to have executive members. You see where I'm going? The more the money you take, the more people you're supporting, the more complexity you're going to take on for your decision processes. And the same thing exists for our ecosystems and when you work with corporations. And that's one of the things that we end up working with a lot of projects on as they grow. How do they go through the same sort of structure all the way down? We don't really have anyone at the public C Corp level where you have SEC depending upon you and things like that, but maybe we'll get there. So how does that translate to your project as you grow and sustain? There's whether you're a BDFL or you go to a committee, or you have lots of committees and have a whole bureaucracy about how to decide certain things, what you keep open, what you keep closed, and then the transparency, how much information you're actually going to share. I think there was a great BOF on just how do we share the information about the diversity in this conference, right? And so you can't share everything. You have to learn how to share certain things and to the right people in the right way to have the most transparent events possible. Awesome. So your community is growing. Uh-oh. Someone shows a sexist image in a tutorial about your software. People are not happy. this happens. Like, it happens quite a bit. And NumFOCUS has developed processes. Gina's done a great job working with our community in the diversity, inclusion, and scientific computing community to develop processes that we can, identify the incident, look at the code of conduct, what are the actual implications of what happened? Is it really what happened? What happened really what you think it happened? And so on and so forth. You can't just assume that just because someone's complaining on the internet that something bad actually happened. And then, off of that, creating that event to support and make it a very inclusive community. We've built out the Discover Cookbook to make inclusive practices on, take your event. So you don't want that to happen again. Hey, here's some practices so that you can learn to not, to encourage people not to proceed down such roads as creating for example, a good example is like a buffet that vegans can't eat at. And those sorts of things, people get pretty upset when they don't have that inclusive kind of atmosphere. And so the whole kind of ecosystem starts to matter a lot more. And you have to start thinking about those policies and how they interact with the rest of the community. And so NumFOCUS often helps people do that sort of thing. All right, next you have a new baby. You'll take some time off, of course. Babies are cute, they smile, they're very nice. But the community is kind of like, well, what do we do? You're gone, huh? How are we going to work? Enter governance. And governance is kind of a big thing. It's really hard. I'm not going to go into like every detail of how to develop your governance plan because it's just too big of a topic. But I wanted to give kind of like a little bit of an idea of like what you need to think about and how to think about like the big picture of like, all right, I've got a lot of community members, I'm taking out money, I have a lot of partners. And I wanted to kind of give 3 kind of basic kind of pieces to it. So Dan Katz and Conrad Henson have been talking about software. They've got this kind of paradigm called software sustainability fundamentals. How do you keep your software sustainable? Like, what does it mean? Then I want to talk a little bit about like, all right, when you're building governance, you have to think about what you're actually protecting. Like, what is the assets that are being governed? And in our cases, it's very, very personal, like the people kind of attitude to that. And then, to use my new favorite word, the opportunities that we have coming out of like governance models and whatnot. So these graphics were all like automatically made by PowerPoint. I was like, oh my goodness, like circular. I got this little. I don't know. I was really happy about these things. I say that because now I have like this road bump thing that I have no idea what that is. But so Conrad and Dan kind of come up with this kind of model of like 3 major things that kind of you have to think about as you're building a governance around your software and your software projects. The big one is like life cycles are circular, consumption is linear. So, you might go on a hype, you might go down, you might have a big wave of interest, it might come around as a big round of hate, and you might get a funding one year and not get funding the next year, get funding another year, you might go to a conference, so on and so forth. But we as people, like we have attention spans and we burn down pretty linearly. So being able to understand that, all right, if I'm actually using up all my team's like interest and focus and love for the project, but that's not going to be here in a year, I better like actually make things that make it easier for them to offload it to other people as I build my project. So you have to think about it a lot earlier than when the cycle goes down. The second is, and I'm going to go into this one a lot more, it's like roles and types of infrastructure cause confusion. And they're really important to understand where you are in the grand scheme of what you can do, like what level interventions you can provide, and so on and so forth. And then finally, the fear of collapse, or because they talk about it as like, what if a software, like the really sustainability is like, what if software collapse? What if Heartbleed happens and all the computers are no longer usable? And it really kind of depends. You have to think about what are the systems using it depending upon it. And so they use a different analogy. I actually went straight with city infrastructure all the way. If you think about a city has slums, Well, not every city has slums, but some cities have slums. And you have residential homes, apartments, and big infrastructure. And you think about, like, slums should really, like, lots of people end up living in them, and really they should be torn down, and you don't want them there. You want to, like, get people to the next stage of their life. Now, you have residential homes, which are really solid for 25, 50 years, but it really services only one family, right? You have a residential apartment, which should last a lot longer, as much as they cost. Although all my condo bills in Chicago, they were much more expensive than I expected. But anyways, but you have servicing of hundreds of families, right? So now if the water goes out in an apartment, it's a much bigger deal than it goes out in a residential home. So you're kind of thinking about how the level of engineering you need to put in that water system at the apartment is much different than the level of engineering you would put in at a residential home. And city infrastructure, it's bedrock, it must not fail, and when it does, Congress people should be taken to task for that, and so on. So so what does that mean in science, right? How does science kind of work this? And I'm not, this isn't like a perfect model, but you can kind of think about how, like, if I have a single research paper, I'm gonna have code behind that single research paper, and I maybe not need, like, every single structure for that single research paper. But if I have a group code, unit tests, unit tests are important in the single research paper, but the group code is a lot more important because people are using the code in ways that you had no idea they would use it. So you have to think about how that will affect what you do, and how you proceed in the future. And then where we actually work a lot is, like, actually the whole domain. Like, you think of, like, AstroPy, and AstroPy is like all of astronomy. It's not just the lensing effect on one telescope, which might be one group, right? And so, or the entire oceanography community is talking to oceanographers here, and, like, all the different things they have to do that are very different from other oceanography communities. And then there's, like, platform, like, if Linux goes away, we're really in trouble. And because of that, like, Linux.com or kernel.org or whatever, people have put up a lot of money to keep that going. Okay, and so the same thing happens in our ecosystems and how we encourage those to other projects and so forth. So we, as a NumFOCUS, like to work on the scientific domain libraries. So if you come to us with a code that you did one research paper with, awesome, we love you. GitHub is fine. You don't need hundreds of thousands of dollars to maintain that. Your group code, if it was like one lab, the real problem for us is more that it's not really a community thing. It's like your one lab. It's got a lot of bias of, like, how to do things to just you, and really your university can support you, so you don't really need us. But when you talk about scientific domain libraries such as NumPy, Pandas, scikit-learn, those sorts of things, well, no single university wants to take that on, and so that's where we really work in a sweet spot. And platform stuff is not really about science. It's about a much bigger ecosystem, so that's kind of where we sit. All right, switching over to business school. So one of the fun exercises I've had joining industry is actually reading business books. And probably the only one that I would recommend is one by a fellow named Goldratt called The Goal. And I definitely recommend everyone to read this book. But they more or less kind of comes as like organizations have a goal. Maximize goods sold while minimizing operational expenses and inventory. Inventory is a little funky. Really what it means is work in progress. This book like revolutionized, it was like the Toyota lean process, but it also like came to America and revolutionized business and so on and so forth. It had a huge effect. How does that affect us? Well, we have goals too. Our goal is usually want to maximize credit. Well, really impact, but that's really hard to measure, so we'll just accept credit, okay? And then really we have, what are we minimizing? Well, operational techniques. This is kind of like expenses, like with the things I need from folks. I think Ralph said I don't want any servers ever, and like so he's really saying I don't want to have a person who just manages a server all the time. So he's minimizing that operational techniques and minimizing the resources we require to do our work and have that impact. Well, that's kind of interesting, but everyone has different versions of this. For example, if I'm a professor at a university, I'm very intellectually motivated. If I'm an engineer at a company, I'm very technically motivated. If I'm a product manager or a community organizer, I'm very community and a steward. And if you're me, you just want money. I'll admit it. So you take this and like, all right, well, I have my roles. I have different credits. I have like citations or user praise or community health, right? You have different resources, whether we're going to federal grants or going to help you advocate to your companies or just going to actual private donations or goodwill to the people, or actually maybe pitching to investors. I think Travis is getting an LP group he always tells me about. And then the techniques are pretty different from each one of these folks. We often in this community like to talk about the crafters and like how software development is so awesome, but scholarly research is really the same sort of like awesome piece that needs to be joined with software development as well. And that's, you have to have both for science and so forth. And in this track, we've been talking a lot about community management and business management and so forth. So the opportunity is how do we bring all those pieces together to give them all credit and give them all the love and things they need. And so NumFOCUS, we've chosen to really focus on scientific domains. This talk was originally given to an NSF audience, and saying that NSF is only one aspect of this whole thing. Substitute NIH or so forth, or whatever funding agency you like. And the goals are definitely not aligned. And like these engines, like they're going to collide and it has that circular cycle and so forth. Just to give you an example within our community of like even like how hard this is to create. So here is like just the documentation for contributing. Like contributing is like the smallest level of governance in our ecosystem. Jupyter, it's a 108-page book if you print it out, starting with everything from architecture decisions down to like references of papers, right? And then Pandas is like one HTML doc that is, you print it out 32 pages. SciPy is on the order of 5 pages and it's just on a GitHub wiki, right? So different levels of different organizations will have the same seemingly the same sort of document, I just want to contribute, but the detail and the application to the different domains is very, very different. And like Jupyter, as we know, like is everywhere, has DevOps, has designers, has makers, creators, all sorts of things, whereas SciPy is much more of a pure math kind of a library. And so maybe the domains will change and the modalities and so forth. Okay, so it's kind of where I want to go with governance. It becomes a very wide issue. We're constantly working with teams on how to actually hit their governance sweet spot. All right, then the community shifts. They start using other projects. Other projects come up with the similar features. Like we have, and the community doesn't really want to like use your stuff, but they want to collaborate with you and so on and so forth. And I think my friend James Howison gave it best of when you're doing open scientific software, he really advocates for you looking at the different strategies for building software, and he shows the platform strategy, which gets used by a lot of companies. And if you think about how you're going to chain together your projects, you could have projects that are just all a mess and depend upon each other, and there's no idea who's doing what. You could have projects that are, you could have panel B, which is like a layered approach, which, this thing depends on that thing, but it can't jump layers, and so you're very close on what exactly can be done. And then there's the platform approach, where there's a well-supported set of libraries and software that is kind of there for everyone, like NumPy and Pandas, and then there's also, and Matplotlib, and there's lots of things that have come out of this, like the PyVis community, and we heard the Vex, new data frames and so forth that depend upon each other and can interplay that way. And this kind of is really well known in the Apple ecosystem. This is how the iPhones and such work and so forth. And I think that advocating for that, it makes a lot of sense. We have that sort of thing where our projects often we think of them as that core platform. There's a lot of like new things coming out of it, but we now have, I think, 28, 29 sponsored projects, and then another like 24 affiliated projects that who maybe don't need as much support as some of our core projects, but are part of the community, are able to get small grant funding and so forth. All right, you apply for a big grant. They tell you your proposal does not have transformational potential. Yeah, this happened. So I want to end on the story about what is innovation, right? So we talk about like we want to sustain, we want to maintain, we want to do all these sorts of things, and really the thing that drives people, like gets them excited, is like transformation, innovation, like going out new features. But I like to like think back to like how the airplane was made. That was a transformational event. I think we would all agree. People kind of focus on the airplane, they see these fast jets and whatnot, but it wasn't really about the airplane when it was built. Like, people were trying to build airplanes for hundreds of years before, and like, what changed to cause this airplane to be built? Well, if you go out to Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, you'll notice that there's this seemingly nice, like kind of hill, like it's a nice sloped hill, but you get up to the top of it and it's like, ooh, that was a climb, at least for a man with such girth. And it's on an embankment right where sea breezes come in. And it changed these young men's lives, where they were able to practice throwing an airplane off the side of a building once a quarter, every 6 months, to 3 times a day. And so they actually built a shack down here at the end, and this is what it looked like. And if you ever go to the monument, you'll see like where they slept in netting, and it was really kind of not a great place to be, it seems, at least. I mean, it's like you go up the hills and you see these nice mansions, and you see the shack, and these are where the people who really wanted to get down and solve something together. And so it really was like turning it upside down and learning by iteration and trial and error, and iterating that they were able to have a much bigger impact. But really it was more of, hey, let's just go tweak this, turn this around, play with this. I mean, you look at the airplane, my first reaction was like, hey, isn't it backwards? Aren't they flying back? I mean, like, so very odd kind of pattern that came out of it, and what happened after that was quite different. And we believe innovation comes from everywhere. Whether you're in busy subways in the country in Africa, in the bazaars of the Middle East, we really want to work with the entire world to get innovation for science wherever we go. And I don't think like small impasses like not transformational should really affect us. I think we have a lot more transformation, and we've already seen a lot of impacts of our work, and we'll have a lot more. And here's some of the great stories that Gina puts out about the work we do and that our community does, and so forth. With that, I think I'm totally out of time, but I invite you to join the conversation, help us do some invisible work, and become a NumFOCUS sustainer. Thank you.
Questions for Andy? Yes.
Hi, Tom Beard, University of Texas at Austin. I had a couple of questions. You had a slide early on about different corporate levels, whether or not they be a C Corp or an S Corp or whatever. And the last one you listed was C Corp with a public offering and the SEC and everything else involved with that. It seems counter to what open source software is all about. And I guess I question, as my first question, do you really want to go there? And that may involve a lot more conversation. Number two, you mentioned it would be difficult to work or has been difficult working with universities in getting them to adopt certain practices, and so I'm concerned, or I'm interested in the experience that you have in that area as far as how to get universities more involved in some of the products and the science computation that all the Python products offer.
Thank you very much for those questions. The first one, I think, I wasn't suggesting we all become public C Corps. I think that was I apologize if that came off that way. I was more trying to illustrate how corporations and money actually causes a graded effect of governance and decisions and processes. And whether or not we want to create those sorts of things or not is up to us. But I think if we look at what's being, like what actually happens in other parts of the world, like it's a good motivator and understander that this is a hard problem. As far as working with universities, I think there's a lot of work going on. I mean, like effectively universities often are just responding to funding agencies and what funding agencies' requirements are, and then what they can get away with. And the comment of like working with offices of sponsored projects and whatnot is just going back and teaching them the value of the ideas, and how giving out the code and the ideas in an open way actually will bring more credit and more information to the world. And I think the famous cases like the B12 patents from Stanford that make them millions or billions of dollars, like universities kind of sometimes focus on that as like a revenue source, and coming back to like, hey, actually what we're really about is scholarship and spreading information and work with the world, rather than just monetizing our professors' ideas, is like an important thing to keep teaching them. And I think that's true of any organization that has to have some money, and it's a constant battle, I think.
All right, thank you.